welcome to our conversation series under the research project European Values and Social Challenges, which is led by Sofia University under the big research project with the acronym SUMMIT, meaning Sofia University Marking Momentum for Innovation and Technological Transfer, financed by the National Recovery and Resilience Plan. My name is Maria Stojceva, and I am the lead researcher of this project, or very often they call it principal investigator, which sounds very interesting for me. Today, I have the privilege to talk to Professor Martin Baret, who is visiting Sofia University as part of our collaboration under the project, and is kind enough to spend a few minutes with us in our conversation series, and to talk to me and to our audience here in the main hall of Sofia University, St. Kliment Охридски. Welcome,
Thank
Martin.
you, it's my pleasure to be here.
The topic of our conversation with you is strengthening democratic values and civic engagement through education. But also there is an additional subtitle to that, is that we will be looking at this issue through the perspective of the Council of Europe. Am I right?
That's correct,
Right.
yes.
So let me first offer a brief biography of Martin for our audience here and also in front of the computers. Martin Baret is currently research professor with us at Sofia University as part of the project I have already mentioned, and also Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Surrey, UK. You have obtained your degrees from the universities of Cambridge and Sussex, and this is the area, your area is the developmental and social psychology, but also you have a very strong commitment to multidisciplinary research. And actually this is what very much brought us together, yes. And we started our work together under the project. I would say that over the years you have worked not just with psychologists, but with educationalists, with political scientists, with policy makers, specifically with anthropologists, so that gives an idea and view of the multidisciplinary perspective that you have incorporated in your professional career. Additionally, I would like to say that, as I know, you are very much interested and focused in your research on young people, and I think this is very important for our research, but also on ethnicity, nation formation, and particularly on citizenship. And in this sense, the main topic of our project, social challenges, is very much related to your research into societal challenges, cultural diversity that can lead to social challenges, especially in relation to young people and children. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct.
I would also like, in this very brief biography that I offer to our audience, to say that you are a lead expert of the Council of Europe, the Education Policy Advisor Network. And that has been for quite a long time. As I remember, that was 2006, so quite a longer time you have been working with the Council of Europe. And since that time, you have worked in many projects related to your specific research interests, but also very much promoting intercultural and democratic values in young people and strengthening their competencies for civic engagement. Am I right?
Yes.
Is that the main focus of your research?
Yes, that is right. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. So let me start with a very general question. You know, sometimes people do not make the differentiation between the Council of Europe and the European Union. That's a very standard question, and those people in the audience who have studied European studies know that this is a very critical moment in the very beginning, but of course we can't expect this subtle difference, particularly when some of the institutions sound very much the same.
That's right.
Yes. So let me start this conversation with you by asking you to say a few words about the Council of Europe and why the Council of Europe has this fundamental interest in democratic values and civic engagement.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you for the question. Yes, this is a very common misunderstanding. When I talk to people and say that I do work for the Council of Europe, they immediately assume our EU. But in fact, the Council of Europe is a completely separate organization from the EU. It actually predates the EU. It's an international organization that was actually set up in 1949 in the aftermath of the Second World War. And there was a single overriding intention behind the founding of the organization, and that was to try to ensure that in Europe, totalitarianism would never arise again. And so the Council of Europe was set up essentially as an institution to protect and to promote three main things in Europe: human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And these three things are now known as the three pillars of the Council of Europe. And all of its activities essentially are dedicated to the promotion and the protection of those three values. Now, the most famous, if you like, convention that the Council of Europe has set up is the European Convention on Human Rights, which all the member states sign up to and agree to act in accordance with. And the most famous organ, really, of the Council of Europe is probably the European Court of Human Rights, which is responsible for legal judgments in relationship to the Convention and how it's being applied within the member states. So the Council of Europe is quite separate and has a very, very different purpose and reason for being than the EU. That said, no country has ever joined the EU without first being a member of the Council of Europe. And that means that all of the EU member states are also signatories to the European Convention on Human Rights as well. Also, the Council of Europe, in a sense, is the origin of the core EU values that appear in the EU Charter. And so, again, you find the same values expressed both by the Council of Europe and by the European Union. So they are related bodies in that sense, in that the membership of the Council of Europe appears to be a pipeline, if you like, to eventual EU membership for countries, but they are two quite separate organizations.
Yeah, that's a very good introduction, but how did you start working or come to work with the Council of Europe?
Yes, people often ask me that because a lot of academics would actually quite like to work for the Council of Europe. They see it as a home for some of their research activities and interests. In my own case, I had met another colleague who is here today, Michael Byram, in the UK, and this was shortly before the Council of Europe was setting up a new project to develop something called the Autobiography of Intercultural Encounters. And this was effectively the brainchild of Michael Byram. And Mike invited me to be a member with the Secretariat of the expert group working to develop the autobiography. Now, the autobiography, I should perhaps explain, is an educational tool that is designed to help and support learners, both in school and in later life, perhaps, to look back over and think about and reflect critically on intercultural encounters that they have had, intercultural encounters that have been particularly important for their own thinking about cultural and intercultural matters. And the idea is that by getting them to think back over their encounters, they will think about what they did within the encounter, whether they could have done something different, if they could have done something better than they actually did at the time. And through this process of critical reflection on the encounter, enhance and develop their intercultural competence. So I was invited to participate in developing that tool, which I did. We subsequently went on. That original tool was to help people think back over face-to-face encounters that they had had with people who have different cultural backgrounds from themselves. And we subsequently developed two further tools. One was an autobiography of intercultural encounters through visual media, which is encouraging people and supporting people in thinking about visual images that they've seen of people from other cultures, and again, reflecting critically on them and on their own reactions to those images. And we also developed the autobiography of intercultural encounters through the internet, which helps people to think back over intercultural encounters that they've had through social media, essentially. So we developed those three tools, and that was my initial work for the Council of Europe.
Do you know, Martin, that we have something in common? This is exactly how I first met Michael Barrow, actually, through this autobiography of intercultural encounters. So that was very interesting as a start, and but what other projects? What sort of projects have you been working with?
It was sort of accidental the way things snowballed, because through working on the autobiography, I was invited to present a paper on the autobiographies to another part of the Education Department's activities at the Council of Europe, the Pestalozzi Programme. The Pestalozzi Programme was run by the Education Department of the Council of Europe, but it was their teacher training program. So I was invited to go there to talk about the autobiographies, which I did. But then I started to get involved in Pestalozzi program activities, and initially I worked on a project in which they were looking at transversal attitude, skills and knowledge for democracy. And then I got involved in another project developing a document called Developing Intercultural Competence Through Education, which Mike Byram also worked on with me. The two of us contributed to this document. And again, we thought that was going to be a sort of self-contained project at the time. But what then happened was, and this was the big turning point, I think, in my work for the Council of Europe, in late 2012, early 2013, Andorra took over the chairmanship of the Council of Europe. And when a country takes over the chairmanship, they introduce policy priorities. And Andorra, for the first time in the history of the Council of Europe, made education its #1 priority. And so they held a chairmanship conference to which I was invited in order to present and disseminate developing intercultural competence through education, the Pestalozzi program publication. So I went to that conference in Andorra in January 2013. But in fact, the main purpose of that conference was to discuss an idea that the Andorran chairmanship had had of developing a new reference framework of the competencies that citizens require in order to participate in democratic culture and in intercultural dialogue as well. And I participated in those discussions, and the overwhelming feeling at that conference, and this was a chairmanship conference, so it had ambassadors from all the member states, and there are 46 member states of the Council of Europe. The ambassadors were all there, and we discussed the feasibility and the reality, practical realities of developing such a framework. And the conclusion of the conference was basically very, very strong endorsement for the idea of developing a new reference framework. And so that recommendation came out of that conference, went to the Education Department, which was mandated to set up an expert group to develop this new reference framework. And so I was invited to become a member of that group, and effectively I ended up leading the group for the duration of its work. We developed the reference framework between 2013 and 2018. The framework was published in 2018, and since that time I've been involved, as you said in your introduction, working as a lead expert for the Education Policy Advisors Network, which is basically supporting and advising member states on how they can implement the framework in their own national education system. So that's largely the work that I've been doing since 2018.
Well, I myself, I have also been involved with working for the Council of Europe, but in developing the Common European Framework for Languages, yes.
Okay.
With some of the colleagues, we translated the framework into Bulgarian, but then the big question came, how it can be used, because it's a very difficult document to work with. So can you tell us something about how this framework that you are talking about, of the competence of a democratic culture, can be used and applied in practice? Yeah.
Yes, well, this is the big question. Right. First of all, I should say that we had a political mandate for developing the reference framework. The political mandate explicitly specified that we should use the language reference framework, the framework that you worked on, as our model. So our framework should specify the competencies that people require in order to be active democratic citizens who can participate in intercultural dialogue with their fellow citizens. And simultaneously, we were mandated to produce descriptors or indicators so that there's a specification, so that if you say that a person, for example, is civic-minded, what does that actually mean in practice? What are the behaviors that would show that a person is civically minded? So we also develop descriptors. So we have a specification of the competencies that need to be acquired. We've got a specification of the behaviors through which those competencies are expressed. But there's actually a third part of the reference framework that I helped to develop, and that is guidance. And the guidance was written explicitly for the ministries of education of the member states and education practitioners who work within the member states. And I should also add, perhaps, that part of the process of developing the framework involved dialogue between the expert group and the ministries of education of all the member states. So this happened through the meetings of the Steering Committee for Education, which basically oversees the activities of the Education Department of the Council of Europe. And every few months, I would go to the meetings of the Steering Committee and report on the progress that we'd made and receive feedback on the work that we'd been doing, because the members of the Steering Committee are representatives of the education ministries of the member states. So we were in dialogue with the ministries throughout the 5 years in which the reference framework was being developed, which I think meant that the third part of the framework, the competencies, the descriptors, but the third part, which is the guidance, was tailored very specifically to the needs of the education ministries in particular. And so we have 6 chapters in that third volume of the reference framework, one on curriculum, one on pedagogy, there's one on assessment issues, there's one on how a whole school approach can be used to basically promote and foster the development of the values that lie at the heart of the framework. There's also a chapter on teacher education, because teacher education is, of course, an absolutely crucial means that you have if you really want this framework to be delivered in effective and appropriate ways by teachers in schools. You need appropriate teacher education programs. And there's also a 6th chapter in there, and this was something that at the political level we were explicitly asked to discuss and to deal with, and that is how the framework can be used basically to combat radicalization leading to violent extremism and terrorism, which the framework can be used for. So there are 6 chapters full of practical information which can be used by education ministries when they're thinking about education policies within their country. But there's a lot of information there as well that can be used by teachers as well directly. Since the framework was developed, we have actually continued to develop a wide range of further materials. And so since 2018, there have been various documents published providing even more direct information and support and guidance for education practitioners in particular. And I hope those materials are going to be very useful indeed for teachers.
For teachers.
Yes.
Okay, so that was a very complex work. So probably my expectation is that you had a lot of discussions within the group.
Yes.
And then you have this dialogue with ministries and representatives of national authorities. So can you tell us something about what is your feeling? What are the challenges, the obstacles? What has come out of this expert discussion?
Yes.
And then in the dialogue with the ministries?
Yes.
If you can...
Yeah. Well, in a way, there are two answers to that question. One is the positive answer and one is the negative. The positive is, I should say, in 2016, while we were still developing the framework, the Council of Europe organised a conference of the education ministers of all the member states. In 2016, this took place in Brussels. And essentially, that conference was convened to showcase the emerging reference framework to the ministers. And the interesting thing that happened at that conference was there was unanimous endorsement of the framework that was being developed. There was a final declaration from the conference, and the education ministers said, yes, this is of great interest to us, and we want the Council of Europe to help us implement the framework. Now, that is at the official political level, unanimous endorsement. But as I said before, the framework was published in 2018. We did a survey in 2019 of the member states to see how many countries were actually doing anything with the reference framework. And in 2019, we found that 17 of the 46 member states were already implementing the framework. That's within 1 year of publication. Now, the figure, the last count, had gone up to 22 member states, and there's another survey currently in progress of the member states, so I would expect the number to go up even higher after that, the results from the current survey come in. So that's the positive sort of outcome, if you like. There has been terrific uptake of the framework, which is very heartening to see. And this is probably because of the support we had from the education ministries and from the ministers at the political level. However, of course, you encounter obstacles to educational reforms of any kind, really. We found all sorts of obstacles were hampering the attempts to implement the framework. One was a lack of training courses for teachers in the principles of the reference framework. Another problem, also linked to teachers, is teachers' perceptions of themselves primarily as transmitters of knowledge rather than as promoters of learners' competencies. So, you know, there are challenges to traditional perceptions of what the teacher's role actually is. There was some resistance from some head teachers who saw their school's duty as really being all about generating educational qualifications and test results for the children at the schools. So there was that difficulty that we encountered, that was being encountered as well. Then there was lack of textbooks and teaching materials and so on in the member states. And then the final problem, I suppose, is the big problem which anybody working in education will know about, and that is the sheer work overload on teachers, head teachers, on teacher trainers, and so on. And the pace of educational reform and keeping up with the continuous changes that keep being made to education systems. And that's a very standard problem that you run into. So those are the sorts of problems that we have encountered. But we're trying to deal with those problems in all sorts of ways. So, for example, there are teacher education courses that have been set up in member states to try and provide the training. The Council of Europe itself, one of the things that we've been doing over the last 5 years is developing a teacher training course, a set of materials that can be used by teacher educators. Those have just been published, those materials, and so those are now available for teacher educators in all the member states to use, are available. Then there is basically the need, if you like, to talk with teachers and head teachers to try and change their perceptions, if you like, of what their role really is. And that involves consultation, negotiation, discussion, very often between local, or I should say national representatives of the country on the Education Policy Advisors Network and with the agents within their countries. And so discussion there, and then discussion also with the publishers of textbooks and textbook teaching materials to try and produce materials that are appropriate. So it's a long process. This is a major process of education reform in the field of citizenship education. It isn't a small task, it is a major task.
That's a major task.
And in a sense, the very positive outcome that we've had so far, you know, is very, very gratifying for all the work that we've done and what we think needs to take place if we are to counter some of the problems that democratic societies in Europe are currently facing.
Yeah. So generally, when you promote the framework, so what are the effects that you describe that can be a result if a country implements the framework in the educational system? So what are the words you use when you want to encourage countries and schools and teachers to refer to the framework?
Well, I think the benefits are twofold. One has to think about them in two different ways. The first way is in terms of the immediate benefits to young people, the people who are being educated in schools at the moment. I think what the framework is attempting to do is to basically empower those learners, empower them to become basically advocates of, promoters of, defenders of human rights, both in their own country and internationally as well, where there is a great need for the promotion of the human rights of people living in other parts of the world, not just in, if you like, the relatively advanced and advantaged countries of Europe. Also, I would expect if learners come through a program based on the reference framework, they will be willing to participate in public debates about public issues. They will be willing to become advocates for democracy in policy debates and discussions within their countries, and also become supporters, defenders of the rule of law within their countries as well. In other words, they will support the three core values of the Council of Europe and those three core values of the European Union as well. Over and above that, our societies are becoming increasingly culturally diverse. They will be equipped with the competencies that they require to interact with, have engaging and interesting dialogue with people from other cultural backgrounds within their own country, and indeed will see the advantages of and the benefits of living within culturally diverse societies, which all European societies are today. That's sort of the first answer, if you like, to your question about the benefits. The second answer is the longer-term perspective. These people who have been educated as effective defenders and promoters of these core democratic values, in later life, if they retain that orientation, which we very much hope they will do, eventually, and we're talking perhaps 20 to 30 years' time, those individuals, or a percentage of them, a proportion of them, will go into positions of responsibility and authority within their societies, the societies in which they're living. And they will take those values to the very heart of, if you like, the governance of their countries and the institutions within their countries. So I think there's the immediate benefits in terms of promoting democratic values in young people for today, but there is a much longer term perspective which we're aiming for as well, which we hope will strengthen the democracies and human rights standards within European countries well into the future.
Okay, I'm really fascinated by your commitment to go into expert work and to try to produce something that is applicable and there available for teachers, for educators, for the educational systems, but how this work, expert work, affects your own research.
Yes.
So can you, and that's my last question, how do you combine these two things? To what extent your expert work has contributed as a focus or guided your research, and the other way around?
Yes, it's been very much a two-way process. So I started out doing research on very different topics at the beginning of my career. I worked on language development and the development of children's drawings. But then I got interested in things like ethnicity and nation and national attitudes and ethnic attitudes, which led me into political attitudes and political orientations of young people and how these developed. And I came with this background in sort of intercultural education and, if you like, civic education, to working for the Council of Europe, and brought those perspectives to bear on the work that I have done for the Council of Europe. And now very much the things I'm doing now are feeding back into research work that I'm engaged in with colleagues in various places across Europe. So I recently was involved in an Erasmus project with partners in various countries, one of which was Bulgaria. We had a partner school in Mesdra in the northwest of Bulgaria. And basically, what we were trying to do was to implement elements of the reference framework in the curriculum of the school. So, and then we had evaluations of the children's civic attitudes in the course of that research project. So it's been very much a two-way street. It's been coming from research, but going into policy-related work, and then taking the policy-related work back out into schools and looking to see what the impact of those policies and the practices based upon those policies actually are on learners themselves in schools. So it's been a bi-directional influence in recent years for me.
Okay. Yes. I think, thank you very much, Martin, for this fascinating insight into how the Council of Europe works, what the aims are, and how these useful instruments are produced. But also, again, I would like to repeat how important your example is, that as researchers, we shouldn't be in our offices, in the library, on our desks, but what we do should be somehow presented in forms, in formats, and in instruments that can be used in the education system, because that's what we were talking today with you. So thank you very much,
My
Martin.
pleasure.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you.